Shalom everybody, and greetings VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. As Israel has been celebrating its 77th year anniversary, we have been fighting arson attacks, environmental terrorism, as well as massive heat across the hills of Jerusalem. There have been fires, and we are calling upon the nations such as Cyprus and Italy and Croatia to come alongside of us, and Greece to help us put out those fires. Well, the big story also this past week is the massive explosion that occurred at the Shahid Rajaei port in the southern Iranian city of Bandar Abbas on Saturday, resulting in at least 70 fatalities and over 1,000 injuries. Then the fires from that explosion burned for over 48 hours, spewing an immense cloud of toxic smoke into the air over this city of over 500,000 people. We'll have all the details about this story for you, as well as some of my own analysis of the regional and global consequences. We'll also have the latest on the war against Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon. All of that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. We start this week's report with some background on the port explosion in Iran, because it's very important to understand that this did not happen in isolation. Iran has a history of industrial accidents, as decades of international sanctions have prevented Iran from building new factories, power plants, and other infrastructure. It's also prevented them from maintaining facilities that were built before the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Spare parts for old machinery are very hard to find, and so old, worn-out machines continue to be used, and they break frequently. This was demonstrated last May when a helicopter carrying the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, also known as the Butcher of Tehran, and some of his senior aides went down with all aboard lost. The helicopter had been bought from the United States before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, meaning it was at least 45 years old. Now, I wouldn't want to drive a 45-year-old car, but the president of Iran had no better option than to fly around in a 45-year-old helicopter. And lo and behold, it broke down and crashed. This sort of thing happens often in Iran, and even when the old worn-out machinery used to drill for oil and natural gas, transport things around power factories and produce electricity and all the rest doesn't break down, it produces an enormous amount of pollution. The air quality in Iranian cities is crazy bad. So much so that there have been serious discussions about moving the capital out of Tehran. Wow. The air pollution there is a national embarrassment, and it's estimated to cause thousands of premature deaths every year. This was a major problem in Bandar Abbas even before this explosion, which prompted city officials to warn residents to stay inside with the windows closed as much as possible because the air quality was suddenly much worse. Now, that's the background to what we saw in Bandar Abbas last Saturday, and it's important to remember because the regime is pointing fingers all over the place in the wake of this disaster, with some officials saying it happened because of improperly stored chemicals or improperly followed safety procedures, etc., etc. All of that is very possible, but there are also some voices in Iran accusing Israel of sabotage. Whoa, us again. And to be honest, that's the first thing I thought of when I heard about this. We'll probably never know, but any time something happens in the Middle East or the wider world that is not good for our enemies, people assume the mysterious and all-powerful hand of Mossad was behind it. Both our friends and our enemies, and even we ourselves, have this as a default assumption. However, I beg to remind everyone of Psalm 121, verse 4, "Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep." I love that verse. Well, with all respect for the Mossad, Shin Bet, IDF, Border Police, Traffic Police, Magen David Adom, the Fire Service, and everyone else who works hard day and night to protect and care for the people of Israel, they are not what we put our trust in. We put our trust in the Lord our God because he has never let us down, and he never will. We never forget that for a moment, and we're keeping in mind as we watch another part of this drama with Iran play out. I'm talking, of course, about the negotiations between the regime that rules Iran and the Trump administration in the United States. Diplomats from the two sides were just sitting down to meetings in Oman Saturday morning when news of the explosion broke, and they're going to meet again, I think, in Rome somewhere. Well, I can only imagine what the Iranian and American delegations were thinking when they heard about it, but I'm quite certain that the calculations of both sides had to be adjusted. Iran's great weakness is the fact that its economy is teetering on the brink of collapse, with its currency among the weakest in the world. So don't buy Iranian currency, my friends. Millions of people are out of work, relentless international sanctions, and rampant corruption. Now, all of that is going to be much more difficult to manage because the port at Bandar Abbas was Iran's gateway to the international economy. The overwhelming majority of Iran's imports and exports goes through this port, and the Russians also use this port for some of their imports and exports, especially to China and India, because it saves them time and money. Initial estimates by the salvage and repair team said that as much as 57% of the port facilities have been rendered unusable by the explosion and subsequent fires. It's going to take months to haul away all the wreckage and repair everything that's been damaged so that the port can get back up to full operational capacity. That means there will soon be shortages of every imaginable commodity in Iran, since nearly everything that Iranian consumers buy in the stores comes into the country through this port. Iran's population is already restive and angry at the regime for all kinds of reasons, and this is sure to intensify. Now, the regime knows all of this, and it puts even more pressure on them to make concessions in negotiations with the United States, but that doesn't mean they will. The negotiations are obviously a stalling tactic meant to delay a joint U.S.-Israeli military strike on their nuclear facilities. According to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and all the other monitoring groups, they are very close to being capable of testing a nuclear weapon, and they're simply trying to buy time to complete the development work. That's the only reason the Iranians are even pretending to negotiate. Don't be fooled, friends. Last week I said that it's even now or never, and I believe that even more this week. The window for a successful strike on Iran's nuclear facilities is closing fast, and Israel's security establishment is making great efforts to convince the Trump administration to stop wasting time on these pointless negotiations, letting the Iranians string us all along like fools and just launch the strikes already, friends. That's a terrible option, but at this point, every other option is even more terrible. Can you imagine if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it will be as if a whole nation put on a suicide bomb belt and is ready to explode the world. Now, there are some indications that the Americans are beginning to see things Netanyahu's way. And one clue about this came this week from the new U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. He spoke at the JNS International Policy Summit held on Monday in Jerusalem, saying that President Donald Trump, quote, won't be dragged into a war. He'll lead it. The president has been very clear that there will never be a possibility for nuclear weapons. He's been explicit about that, unquote. This followed Netanyahu's speech on Sunday when he declared that the only good deal that works is a deal like the one that was made with Libya, that removed all of the infrastructure. By this he means, and I think he's correct, that letting Iran have even a civilian nuclear power production program is too much of a risk, because most of what the country needs to produce nuclear weapons is already included in such a program. Several countries all over the world that have advanced nuclear power production infrastructure have long maintained that they are capable of producing nuclear weapons very quickly if they felt they need to do so. This includes Japan, South Korea, Germany, etc. Now, some people ask, what's the problem with Iran having a peaceful nuclear power production capacity like so many other countries have? The problem is their stated intent to wipe Israel off the map and subjugate their Arab neighbors. Germany and Japan haven't started an aggressive war against their neighbors in a long time, so they've shown that they can be trusted with nuclear power, while Iran has done the exact opposite. And they are also looking for the return of a Mahdi, a Messiah, and so they don't care if it's apocalyptic to bring him back. Well, last but not least, as I said last week, if Iran gets the bomb, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and possibly others will want one too, and there's no way to predict how far it'll go from there. The more countries have nuclear weapons, the more likely it is that they'll be used, and the world is already in pretty bad shape without that happening, don't you think? That's what's at stake here. But of course, Iran has threatened to hit Israel with yet another barrage of ballistic missiles at some point, no matter what happens with these nuclear negotiations. Even before that, the threat of shorter-range rockets, drones, and missiles from the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and others remains. That's why here at Vision for Israel, we're continuing with our efforts to provide bomb safety shelters to communities all over Israel, and I invite you to watch this short video about that project. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know, having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture. In Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, everybody, and in the second half of this week's report, we'll give you a rundown of some of the other big stories out of Israel and the Middle East this week, starting with a look at the struggle against the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. The story here is short and straightforward. The Houthis are being bombed to smithereens by the United States Navy and Air Force, but they're still refusing to surrender. They're still firing ballistic missiles at Israel, and they're still firing missiles at international shipping in the Red Sea. They're even trying to fire on the U.S. military, and I'm amazed to have to tell you this, but they've had some success. They've shot down at least 7 MQ-9 Reaper drones in the past few weeks, and they also forced the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier to take emergency evasive action earlier this week, which resulted in an FA-18E jet being lost overboard. Those drones cost $30 million apiece, by the way, and the jet cost American taxpayers $60 million. Now that's a big problem, friends, and I wish I had an easy answer to it, but the fact is that when you go to war, you expend ammunition, burn fuel, lose equipment, and sometimes you even suffer casualties, and all of that costs money. It also does a lot of damage to the physical environment, and that's a topic I don't even think has ever been given the attention that it deserves. But getting back to the subject of money, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute published their annual report this week, showing that the governments of this world are spending more on weapons, ammunition, and the other means of war today than at any other point since the height of the Cold War in the mid-1980s. Israel is prominently mentioned in this report as we are spending a terrifying amount of money on this war, including over $5 billion. $5 billion just in the month of December 2024, which was the height of the campaign against Hezbollah, our most dangerous enemy near our borders. Now, that campaign was successful in severely degrading the ability of Hezbollah to threaten Israel, and there was no choice but to do what was done. We're still having to strike Hezbollah on a regular basis, by the way, and just this last Sunday, the Air Force hit a weapons storage warehouse in the Dahia neighborhood of southern Beirut, which was being used to store some of Hezbollah's guided missiles. They put these weapons in the heart of a civilian neighborhood in order to use the people who live there as human shields. Despicable. Hoping that Israel wouldn't strike them for fear of hitting civilians. This is a tactic they and Hamas have used often, and Israel's only choice is to do what the IDF did, which is send several messages to the civilian population of the neighborhood to tell them that, unfortunately, Hezbollah has placed weapons amidst them, and the IDF must destroy them. So these people needed to get out of harm's way as quickly as possible and hope that the destruction of these missiles wouldn't result in the destruction of their homes and businesses as well. Once again, Hezbollah is responsible for this destruction. And I am happy to tell you that a growing number of Lebanese people seem to understand that. The Lebanese National Army in particular is becoming more and more willing to confront Hezbollah, raid their weapons storage facilities so they can be dismantled before Israel needs to hit them, and even preventing Hezbollah from firing into Israel. They aren't doing that because they love us. They're doing it because they're tired of Hezbollah picking a fight with Israel it can't win and bringing death and destruction to Lebanon. These people don't want to fight Israel anymore. They just want to live their lives in peace, and they're taking their country back. I say good for them, and it's worth remembering PA President Mahmoud Abbas, who last week told Hamas to stop trying to be clever and just release the Israeli hostages already, so Israel will no longer have an excuse to attack in Gaza. Once again, Abbas didn't say that because he loves us in Israel, but because on some level he's come to the conclusion that there's no point in fighting Israel anymore, and it's time to start trying to build something positive for his own people. Now, that's a conclusion that the leaders of Egypt, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and others already came to years ago when they made peace with Israel. Now, I can only hope and pray it continues to gain traction all over the region. President Trump has made a normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia a major priority of his administration. It was already close to happening before the October 7th attack by Hamas, and as soon as this war is over, I believe it'll get back on track. Now, speaking of the end of this war, Hamas has put an offer on the table to release all the remaining hostages in exchange for a 5-year ceasefire with international guarantees. Israel's political leadership has flatly rejected this idea, although there was plenty of support for it among the general public. First, I'll explain why the leadership rejected it, and then I'll explain why there was so much support for this idea. To start with, the governing coalition that Prime Minister Netanyahu leads is composed of his own Likud party and several other parties which are much further to the right on the political spectrum. None of these parties have very many seats in the current Knesset, but when they're added up, there are enough seats to allow the Likud to have a majority. Now, if any of them leave the coalition, it could make things very difficult for Netanyahu and maybe even force new elections. If the most recent polls are any indication, Netanyahu would have a very difficult time forming a new coalition from the parties that would make it into the next government. So Netanyahu has no choice but to placate these small parties to keep his coalition intact. That's parliamentary elections and coalitions. These small parties are adamant that there should be no compromise with Hamas and no giving it an opportunity to recover from the damage already inflicted on it so that they can come back and attack us again in a few years. That's undeniably what they'd like to try and do, and that's why they're demanding a 5-year ceasefire. They probably think they can bounce back and be ready for another round in less than 5 years, and they might be right about that. So the alternative idea, which is the IDF mobilizing another large contingent of reservists and going back into the Strip full throttle to destroy Hamas once and for all, is the one they're insisting on, and it looks like that's what's going to happen. Now, I say that with some caution because there's a chance it won't happen, and here's why. The families and supporters of the remaining hostages are saying that further fighting is pointless, and if there's a chance to get their loved ones back, it's time to go for it. Furthermore, there is a small but growing movement of IDF reservists, many of whom have served for hundreds of days over the past 18 months, who are saying they just can't do it anymore. Marriages, businesses, and communities are starting to break down under the strain of having so many men away from home for long periods of time. I know this in my own family. On this note, I have to tell you that despite the overwhelming victory over Hezbollah in Lebanon, only about 15,000 or so of the 60,000 residents of northern communities who were evacuated at the start of this war have even returned to their homes. It's not only because of the lingering fear of being attacked, it's also because many of these communities sustained serious damage from rockets and missiles fired at them by Hezbollah, and they need to be rebuilt. Many forested areas also burned, and in general, the landscape is in desperate need of repair and renewal. That's a subject for future reports, but for now, it's enough for you to know that although this war isn't over yet, the repair and recovery stage has already begun. And that's the good news, but here's the bad news. Remember what I said before about all the money the government has had to spend on the military in this war? Well, that means there's less money for all the other things the people of this country need. A member of my staff tells me that the school his children attend was in the process of being refurbished when the war started. The work was 95% completed, and the new wing that had been built, which is badly needed, was supposed to be opened in January of 2024. But then this war started in October 2023, and a year and a half later, the new wing is still not open because the government can't spare the fairly small amount of money needed to do the last little bit of the work. I hear similar stories all over Israel as people are under tremendous stress. And that's why at Vision for Israel, our ministry organization, we're committed to doing what we can to ease the burden. We'd like to do a lot more, but we need your help. Here's a short video which tells about some of the projects we have to relieve some of the stress on Israel's home front. We all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Welcome back, everybody, and I want to conclude this report by once again quoting Ambassador Mike Huckabee, I like that guy, who said during the JNS conference on Sunday that the battle against Hamas and all the other proxies of Iran, quote, is not a geopolitical struggle, but rather this is a vertical battle between heaven and hell. To that I say a hearty amen. Furthermore, when I hear the siren, which lets me know it's time to run to the bomb shelter because the Houthis have fired another ballistic missile at Israel, or about Hezbollah's attempts to rearm, or Hamas's refusal to surrender, it reminds me of something. It's like the closing days of World War II, when allies were pushing across Europe towards Berlin from the east, west, and south, and no one in Germany could have any illusions at that point that the end was near. Some surrendered, but many fought on, and the whole time they continued at a furious pace to murder as many Jews as they could, driven by the demonic powers who had prompted them to start the Holocaust in the first place. The same powers of hell that motivated the Nazis to commit genocide against the Jews of Europe are still very busy motivating jihadist groups to try and do the same thing today, and I'm glad Mike Huckabee is here to remind us of that battle. This is not just a physical battle, it's also a spiritual battle, and we need to be fighting it in prayer as well as in giving practical support to Israel as best we can. Now, on that note, I want to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news, and here it is. This week, the people of Israel marked two very important occasions, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, one right after the other. The first is Memorial Day for all the soldiers, police officers, and other members of security services who have fallen in battle while defending this country, as well as those civilians who have been slain in terror attacks. Now, the fires broke out on that very day, and I'm sad to say I think it was arson, but we'll wait to see what the investigations tell us. Now, the counting starts all the way back in 1860 because it was in that year that the Jewish community in Jerusalem started building the first neighborhood, Yemin Moshe, outside the old city walls. Some Arab men objected to this and they attacked the work party, resulting in a fight which left one Jewish man and two Arab men dead. That Jewish man was the first casualty counted in the number, which this year reached 25,420. Another 5,229 civilians have been killed in terrorist attacks going back to 1851 for a total of 30,649 casualties. That doesn't sound like good news, but here's the thing. The very next day we celebrated Independence Day. And remember what the nation of Israel got for the sacrifice of all those lives and a great deal of hard work and effort, I might add. This year, as I said, we mark 77 years of independence, and we look forward to many more years ahead. With that, I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. So if you were blessed by it, please consider sharing it, encouraging others to watch this broadcast, and subscribing to various social media sites we have. And we'll see you next week, and pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee.